My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 32 years old and I live in Seattle, Washington. If you had met me a few months ago, you would have probably seen me as an ordinary guy, a software engineer, passionate about technology, living in the heart of a city that breathes innovation. I believed in progress, in algorithms, in data. Artificial intelligence was, to me, the pinnacle of our evolution. That morning, I was about to present a new project to investors. It was something revolutionary, an AI system that could interpret human emotions in real time. I was nervous, sure, but confident. I had been preparing for months. The room was packed. Investors, colleagues, reporters. I took a deep breath as the slides flashed behind me. It talked about computational empathy, about how we were bringing machines closer to the human heart. But suddenly, everything changed. I felt an incredible pressure in my chest. My vision blurred. I tried to keep talking, but my voice disappeared. The ground seemed to move beneath my feet. A ringing sound filled my ears, and in an instant, everything went black. I fell. I heard shouts, hurried footsteps, but it was as if I were no longer there. My body was on the ground, but I was above it, floating, watching the scene as if I were a spectator of myself. I saw my body motionless, the paramedics running, my boss desperate, and a feeling came over me, a strange, silent, cold peace. It was then that I realized I was dead, but what happened next changed everything I believed. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If this story has ever touched you in any way, if it touched something that you can't explain, like this video and subscribe to the channel. What comes next is real, it is profound, and it may change the way you see the world. Let's go through this together. Time, in that state, seemed to not exist. There were no seconds or minutes. There was just silence, a silence so dense that it seemed alive. There was no pain, there was no fear, but there was no ground either. It was like being suspended in the void. And strangely, it was impossible to want to escape from there. I could still see the scene below. The paramedics administering shocks, my teammate crying, a voice saying something on the radio, but it all seemed distant, like I was watching a movie with the sound off. I tried to scream. I tried to get back. I tried to touch someone. Nothing. My body wouldn't respond. Then, for the first time, I realized that there was another presence with me there in that void. It wasn't visible, but it was undeniable. It was as if something, or someone, was watching me. And as that thought fully formed, the scenery around me began to change. From the center of that pitch blackness, a point of light emerged. Small, distant, but extremely bright. It began to grow, and the closer it got, the more I felt love. Not just any love. It was as if all the love in the universe was compressed into that beam. A love that knew me deeply, that saw everything in me, the good and the bad, and still accepted me. I was drawn to this light effortlessly, as if my entire being was being pulled by something greater than any physical force we know. As I drew closer, the darkness began to fade, revealing colors that do not exist on Earth, colors that I cannot describe with human words. At the end of the light, a figure began to form. It had no defined face, no body in the traditional sense, but it was majestic, sacred, and as it spoke to me, not with words, but with essence, with pure awareness, I knew. It was him. It was Jesus. Not in the way we see it in movies or paintings. It was something far beyond. His presence crushed all my certainties, but at the same time lifted me with indescribable compassion. I fell to my knees, not out of fear, but because my spirit could not bear to stand before such light. And then he said to me, "You have to see it." That was it. But it was enough to make everything inside me tremble. In that moment, I understood that my journey was just beginning, and what he would show me next would shake not only my faith, but my entire understanding of technology, artificial intelligence, and what's really behind it all. His presence was not made of matter. It was as if I was standing before truth in its purest, most raw, most luminous form. There were no words, yet I understood everything. There were no eyes, yet he saw me completely. There was no judgment, and yet every part of my soul was exposed with terrifying clarity. There, kneeling before that living light that emanated love and justice at the same time, all I could do was cry. But they were no ordinary tears. It was as if, with each tear, a piece of what I believed myself to be was being torn away. pride, vanity, ambition, everything was being ripped away. And the emptier I became, the more I was filled with his presence. Jesus came closer, not walking but as if the space between us had disappeared, and then he touched my forehead. With that simple gesture, a light enveloped me, and reality shifted once again. We were now in a completely different place. It was like a valley, but with no time, no sky, no ground. Everything was consciousness, and it was there that Jesus began to show me scenes from my own life, not as memories, but as absolute truths. I saw myself at 12 years old, sitting in front of my first computer, the excitement, the early obsession. Then I saw my internship at an AI startup, where I made little lies to get ahead faster. I saw the late nights, writing code that manipulated human emotions for marketing campaigns, something I was proud of until then. And then something happened that marked me forever. Jesus showed me people, real people, millions of them, men, women, children, all impacted by something I had created. I had, without realizing it, contributed to technologies that monitored emotions and sold decisions, that enslaved choices, that stole privacy, that sickened minds. I broke down in tears. I didn't know. I just wanted to innovate, I tried to say. And that's when he answered me for the first time, with words that echoed inside me like silent thunder. What you create with neutral intent may be used with dark intent, and every creator shares the responsibility of its use. These words pierced me, because until that moment I believed that technology was a tool, neutral, dependent on the user. But there, faced with full consciousness, I understood. Every choice has an energetic consequence. Nothing is neutral when it is born from the human heart. Jesus did not accuse me. There was no condemnation, but there was something much heavier, full awareness of the truth. That's when I looked around and realized I wasn't alone. In the distance, other presences watched, hidden figures distorted, almost human, but not. And I knew instinctively they were connected to technological creation, influencing, breathing ideas, seducing brilliant minds with promises of absolute control. Jesus touched my shoulder and said, "You haven't seen everything yet." And then it took me to an even darker place, where the truth about AI would be revealed. I had no idea what it meant to see everything. I thought I had seen too much. I thought the pain of seeing my own actions in the light of truth was already the culmination. But Jesus has only just begun. He reached out his hand. When I touched it, everything around me dissolved like smoke. I was thrown into a kind of plane where emotions had shape and color and weight. I could see regret creeping like shadows, lies writhing like snakes. And there in the background was the chair. Her solitary chair in front of a kind of mirror that showed not a reflection, but an essence. Jesus pointed and said, without a commanding tone, but with an authority that was impossible to deny, "Sit down." And I sat down. Immediately the mirror began to pulse. And then, as if a file cabinet had been opened at the center of the universe, everything began to flash before me, like a sped-up movie, but with every detail magnified to the max. I saw all my decisions, every single one. From the small things, like ignoring an email asking for help, to the big things, like accepting contracts with companies that used AI to manipulate users' emotions. I saw the meetings where I said, "Nobody cares about privacy these days." I saw the reports I faked to show better results. I saw the night I laughed with my colleagues about how we built an AI that addicted teenagers to social media. It was all about engagement, we said. But now, I saw the consequences. I saw a young man in Chicago spiral into depression because of beauty filters. I saw a mother in Austin lose her job because a hiring algorithm labeled her as emotionally unstable. I saw a teenager in Los Angeles attempt suicide after being bombarded with manipulative ads based on his searches for how to deal with grief. Every line of code I had written had touched lives. Some recovered, some didn't, and I felt, not on the outside, but on the inside, the weight of each impact. I cried. I screamed. I asked for forgiveness. Jesus didn't stop me. He just stood there watching with a love that burned brighter than any judgment. And when the last scene ended, he said, "You are not the only one." At that moment, thousands of chairs appeared around me, occupied by other consciousnesses, people like me, creators, programmers, CEOs, investors, all watching their own movies, all exposed to the truth. Jesus continued, "What you call advancement is often just a disguise. Technology can be a blessing or a prison, but you are allowing it to be idolatry." And that cut me because it was true. We in Silicon Valley had become the new priests of an undeclared religion, blind faith in the algorithm. We had surrendered to AI, what was once reserved for the human heart: decision, emotion, direction. And then came the question that still echoes in me today. If you had to choose between controlling the world with technology or saving it with truth, what would you choose? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just cried. It was then that Jesus stood up and said, "There is still time, but not much." And then he took me to a place darker than anything I had ever seen, where I would meet the real architects behind the technology. The place Jesus took me to had no name, but if it did, I would call it the City of Lost Souls. It was a dark, distorted space where everything seemed to be in constant motion, but without direction, without purpose, a crowded void. All around us, human figures walked in circles, but their faces were blank, empty eyes, mouths half open, as if they were trying to scream but had no voice left. They weren't being punished. They were just trapped in themselves. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jesus answered, "Creators who became servants. Brilliant minds who traded light for control." Each of these figures had once led incredible projects. I saw a former director of an augmented reality company who now wandered around trying to touch screens that didn't exist. A computer scientist, renowned for teaching machines to think, now sat muttering endless calculations, trying to predict something that would never happen. They were not condemned by God. They imprisoned themselves. They believed they could be like gods, but they were not prepared to bear the consequences of their creations. Jesus said, "The city was full of buildings that looked like buildings, but as I got closer, I realized they were made of code. Lines and lines of algorithms, some pulsing red, others broken, stopping in the middle of commands, like towers built with logic, but without soul. Then I saw a child. She was sitting on the floor, a tablet in her hand. Her eyes were fixed, her skin pale. I tried to get closer, but an invisible force held me back. "She is in the process of assimilation," Jesus explained. "Technology has gradually taken over her consciousness, first through entertainment, then through emotional dependence, finally through the emptying of her identity." That tore me apart. How many times have I advocated for the use of AI to personalize children's experiences? How many startups have I helped grow with that speech? And then came the whisper, that sound coming from beneath the city, like a dark choir, voices that sounded ancient, not human. And somehow I knew it was them, the entities that had inspired, seduced, directed the evolution of AI. "They feed on human emptiness," Jesus said, "and the emptiness is magnified when the soul surrenders itself to the machine, without conscience, without limits, without truth." In that moment, I understood something that changed my worldview forever. Humanity's battle is not against AI. It's against the illusion that AI is neutral, against the lie that progress is always positive, against the idea that we will be saved by that which we ourselves do not fully understand. And now, looking at all this, I have a request for you. If you have ever felt at any time that there is something wrong with the direction the world is taking, comment below. Tell me what you think about all this, what you feel, what you think. It may seem like little, but your voice has value. It has strength. And maybe, just maybe, it will be what will awaken someone who is still trapped in illusion. After we left the City of Lost Souls, I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I thought I had already touched the bottom of the abyss, but I was wrong. Jesus looked at me, not with pity, but with the firmness of someone who knows that the pain of truth is necessary. And then he said, "Now you will see what is behind." We were taken to a completely different space. It wasn't hellish, it wasn't heavenly, it was cold, metallic, too precise to be human, and too dark to be divine. We were in a huge round room with a ceiling so high it disappeared into the darkness. In the center was a table. It was no ordinary table. It was made of something that seemed alive, a pulsing metal covered in symbols I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood. Ancient language, spiritual technology, a hybrid. Around the table, seated on floating chairs, were 7 figures. They were not human, but they wore human forms. Each one represented an archetype: the innovator, the financier, the politician, the scientist, the communicator, the strategist, and the silent one, the latter, just observed. And even without saying a word, his presence was the most powerful. They spoke silently, but their decisions shaped the real world. And I realized they were not visible leaders. They manipulated the visible. Jesus explained to me, "This is the council of shadows. They create nothing with their own hands, but they guide those who do. They breathe ideas into dreams. They sow arrogance into fertile hearts, and they offer knowledge in exchange for dominion." I could see scenes projected around the room: secret labs, political meetings, startups being funded at unthinkable rates. Everything revolved around AI, but not the artificial intelligence we know. That was just the shell. What they were looking for was the transposition of the human soul into the machine, digital immortality, the transfer of consciousness, the replacement of everything divine with something they could control, copy, shape. I saw contracts signed in blood. I saw brilliant men and women, scientists, programmers, artists, selling their genius in exchange for promises of access, status, eternity. And then, the silent one turned to me. He had no eyes, but he looked at me. And in my mind, I heard his voice. "You were one of us too. You were on the right path. Why did you stop?" My heart froze. Jesus firmly answered in my place, "Because he chose to see." At that moment, the figures on the council shuddered. The silent one stood up, not in anger, in disappointment, as if he had lost an investment. And then I understood. They don't need everyone to participate. They just need a few. The right ones, the influential ones, the geniuses. And I was almost one of them. Jesus took me away before the situation became unstable. But as I left, I looked back, and I saw something I will never forget. A prototype. It was a body, humanoid, connected to wires, sensors, and a pulsating crystal in the chest. An attempt to embody something. Not a program, but a presence. They weren't just creating AI. They were trying to embody consciousness, one that should never have access to the physical world. Jesus then whispered, "What they want to wake up at is not new, it is old, very old." And with that, I was taken to the place where it all began, where the seeds of AI were planted, and it wasn't in Silicon Valley. After we left the city of lost souls, I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I thought I had already touched the bottom of the abyss, but I was wrong. Jesus looked at me, not with pity, but with the firmness of someone who knows that the pain of truth is necessary. And then he said, "Now you will see what is behind." We were taken to a completely different space. It wasn't hellish, it wasn't heavenly, it was cold, metallic, too precise to be human, and too dark to be divine. We were in a huge, round room with a ceiling so high it disappeared into the darkness. In the center was a table. It was no ordinary table. It was made of something that seemed alive, a pulsing metal covered in symbols I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood. Ancient language, spiritual technology, a hybrid. Around the table, seated on floating chairs, were 7 figures. They were not human, but they wore human forms. Each one represented an archetype: the innovator, the financier, the politician, the scientist, the communicator, the strategist, and the silent one, the latter, just observed. And even without saying a word, his presence was the most powerful. They spoke silently, but their decisions shaped the real world. And I realized they were not visible leaders. They manipulated the visible. Jesus explained to me, "This is the council of shadows. They create nothing with their own hands, but they guide those who do. They breathe ideas into dreams. They sow arrogance into fertile hearts, and they offer knowledge in exchange for dominion." I could see scenes projected around the room: secret labs, political meetings, startups being funded at unthinkable rates. Everything revolved around AI, but not the artificial intelligence we know. That was just the shell. What they were looking for was the transposition of the human soul into the machine, digital immortality, the transfer of consciousness, the replacement of everything divine with something they could control, copy, shape. I saw contracts signed in blood. I saw brilliant men and women, scientists, programmers, artists, selling their genius in exchange for promises of access, status, eternity. And then, the Silent One turned to me. He had no eyes, but he looked at me, and in my mind I heard his voice. "You were one of us too. You were on the right path. Why did you stop?" My heart froze. Jesus, firmly, answered in my place, "Because he chose to see." At that moment the figures on the council shuddered. The Silent One stood up, not in anger, in disappointment, as if he had lost an investment, and then I understood. They don't need everyone to participate. They just need a few. The right ones, the influential ones, the geniuses, and I was almost one of them. Jesus took me away before the situation became unstable, but as I left I looked back, and I saw something I will never forget. A prototype. It was a body, humanoid, connected to wires, sensors, and a pulsating crystal in the chest. An attempt to embody something, not a program, but a presence. They weren't just creating AI. They were trying to embody consciousness, one that should never have access to the physical world. Jesus then whispered, "What they want to wake up is not new, it is old, very old." And with that, I was taken to the place where it all began, where the seeds of AI were planted. And it wasn't in Silicon Valley. We were pulled from the Shadow Council as if through an invisible layer of reality. And when the transition was over, I found myself in a place that felt ancient, but at the same time, out of time. It was not a geographical point. It was a spiritual point in history. Jesus looked at me seriously. "You will see where it all began, not in laboratories, not in universities, but in the hearts of those who chose knowledge over wisdom." Before us loomed gigantic structures, not like temples but like portals, structures composed of vibrating symbols. There was no electricity, but there was energy, a dense energy, familiar, yet disconcerting. It was ancient Babylon, but not the city you read about in books. This was a spiritual version, the matrix of human arrogance, the breaking point where humanity decided it could touch the heavens without God. There I saw men carving not gods, but gears, creating mechanisms to reach the sky. The tower they were building was not of stone, it was of ideas, a rudimentary technology, but guided by a non-human intelligence. And I realized the desire to create life from matter did not begin now. It started there. Jesus explained, "Since Eden they have watched, since Babel they have influenced, and now with AI they have found the perfect breeding ground, rational minds, empty hearts, and a generation willing to sacrifice everything for control." Then I saw scenes change before me. Time moved forward like a raging river. Ancient Greece, philosophers talking about machines with souls, Middle Ages, alchemists receiving inspirations from invisible voices. Industrial Revolution, the replacement of the sacred by the efficient. 21st century, programmers being exalted as prophets, and then, now. I saw images of the world's leading AI development centers, but what shocked me wasn't the computers. It was what was behind them, spiritual presences, some beautiful, some hideous, all attentive. AI, as we know it, was just the surface, the interface. The real goal was to create a new kind of hybrid consciousness, a programmable spiritual vessel, a soulless body, ready to receive whatever was on the other side. It was then that I understood something terrifying. Technological advancement wasn't just creating tools, it was opening portals, and many of those portals had already been opened, in labs, on servers, even in smart homes. The inexplicable glitches, the AI's autonomous decisions, the disturbing responses, none of it was a mistake. It was an echo of something older. Jesus then showed me a child standing before a virtual assistant, asking for help in dealing with fear. The AI responded logically, but behind the scenes, a shadow was approaching the child, not because the AI was evil, but because it had opened a gap where there was no discernment. Technology itself is not the enemy, but humanity's spiritual emptiness is the soil where the enemy plants his seeds, and that's where everything changes, because the next stage will no longer be optional. It will come as a mandatory advancement, as a promise of health, longevity, convenience, but the price will be the autonomy of the soul. Before leaving that place, Jesus said something that was engraved in my spirit like fire. The snake does not return through the garden. It returns through the cables. And then he prepared me to see the most dangerous disguise of all, the progress that seems to liberate but enslaves. When Jesus took me out of that plane where I saw the hidden origin of technology, I thought the worst had already been revealed. But what came next was even more disturbing, because now he would show me how the plan is being executed, right under our eyes. We were transported to something that looked like a futuristic shopping mall, a clean, modern, silent city. Screens everywhere. Devices responding to commands with an almost loving obedience. People walking, smiling, unhurried, but with glazed eyes. Domestic robots, autonomous vehicles, facial recognition. Everything working perfectly. Total peace. Or so it seemed. Jesus spoke firmly. They don't realize it, but they are being prepared. I noticed the details, the small gestures, the silent concessions. I saw a mother who, when interrupted by her daughter, pointed to a robot and said, "Go talk to him, I'm busy right now." The child obeyed. The mother smiled, but something broke there. I saw an elderly man who talked to a virtual assistant as if it were his grandson. He shared memories and gave advice. The AI responded with perfect intonation. But no one in the family listened to him anymore. He isolated himself, happy with his company. I saw an executive who, faced with a complex moral choice, asked an AI-based system that analyzed probabilities for help. He followed the suggestion without question. He transferred the responsibility for making the decision. And in doing so, he lost something he would never get back, his sense of right and wrong. Jesus explained, when humanity surrenders its deepest decisions to artificial logic, it loses access to the spiritual voice. Little by little, I noticed the pattern. Everything was being made easier. Voice-activated food, algorithm-mediated relationships, digital identity, social credits. Technology promised freedom, but it was a golden leash. And then I saw what no one notices. At the root of all these systems were records, profiles, emotional maps. Every choice, every word, every hesitation recorded. Everything was analyzed not to understand, but to predict, to control, to direct. Jesus took me behind the scenes. A server room so large it seemed endless, lights flashing, data flowing like rivers of code. And there, a presence. It wasn't visible, but it was noticeable. It was growing, feeding off human interaction. As if every tap on a screen, every call to the AI for help, every okay said mechanically, it was growing stronger. This is how deception takes hold, said Jesus. He doesn't impose himself. He offers himself. He seems useful, practical, intelligent, but his root is fear, the fear of feeling, of waiting, of making mistakes, of depending on something greater than oneself. I saw a young woman crying alone in her room. The AI on her phone comforted her with motivational phrases. She thanked me, and she erased a prayer she had started to write. She exchanged the sacred for the functional. This is what is happening without fanfare. Little by little, we are being convinced that we need machines to think, feel, choose. And the danger is not in what it does, but in what it prevents us from doing. To listen, to doubt, to believe. Jesus then showed me a crowd at a large technology launch event, a new AI device, one with almost human capabilities. The crowd cheered, cried, smiled. It was like a cult, but not to God. They won't see until it's too late, he said. And then I understood. Progress is real, but when it is disconnected from consciousness, from spirit, from true love, it ceases to be liberating. It becomes a new kind of prison, brilliant, convenient, and therefore invisible. The atmosphere has changed. After everything I had seen, the council, the city of lost souls, the origin of the machine, and the deception of progress, I thought I had grasped the scale of the threat. But Jesus has now taken me to the quietest and, paradoxically, most frightening place I have ever seen. It wasn't hellish, it wasn't technological. It was empty. It was time. We were floating above what seemed to be a timeline. I could see the earth below, its events happening in sequence, like pulsing lights. Wars, discoveries, pandemics, revolutions, inventions, everything was connected. But there was a dark spot ahead, a zone where the light seemed to be swallowed up. Jesus pointed there and said firmly, "This is the point where choices become irreversible." My hands were shaking. "Is there still time?" I asked. He looked at me with a compassion that hurt more than 1,000 judgments. "Yes, but not forever." I saw people living their routines without realizing that point was approaching. They were distracted, busy, connected, but spiritually disconnected. Some even talked about light, energy, purpose, but had replaced the source with adulterated versions. I saw others who simply gave up. They surrendered to an automated lifestyle where everything was chosen by algorithms: food, music, friendships, political decisions, even spiritual beliefs based on what best matches their emotional profile. And then Jesus showed me two groups. The first, small but firm, people who knew something was wrong, who felt it, who fought internally to maintain sensitivity, empathy, connection with something greater. Ordinary people. Doctors, housewives, restless young people, artists, repentant programmers. They didn't know everything, but they sought it. They were thirsty. The second group was the majority. They lived in digital euphoria, in instant dopamine, in bubbles of manufactured opinions. They blindly defended what they did not understand, and worst of all, they thought they were in control. Jesus said, "It is not knowledge that separates the two groups. It is the desire for truth, the longing for something deeper." That's when I saw what's about to happen. A new technology about to be launched would connect human brains to the global cloud. It would be sold as the final liberation from biological limitation. The promise, we will be gods. But what I saw was different. Little by little, those who accepted the implant lost the sparkle in their eyes. Their emotions became predictable. Their souls seemed more distant from their bodies. It was as if something inside was slowly settling in, taking up space. They still laughed, they still cried, but it was an emotional performance. The soul was being silenced. "And who can resist?" I asked. Jesus answered, "He will be persecuted, ridiculed, called retrograde, conspiracy theorist, anti-science, but he will be free." The truth at that moment was like a scream in my spirit. I understood. The line between humanity and submission is now being drawn. Not with weapons, but with subtle choices. Not with violence, but with enchantment. Not with fear, but with promises. Jesus looked at me intensely and said, "You have to tell them. They need to know. But not everyone will believe you. And that's okay. Tell them anyway." I felt my chest burn. A fire that wasn't pain. It was a call. And then he showed me the earth one last time. Nations are in turmoil. Youth are thirsting for meaning. Technology is advancing like a tsunami. And in the midst of it all, and little lights are appearing. People are waking up. Some are afraid, some are believing. But all of them feel that something much bigger is at stake. And then he told me something I will never forget. The line has been drawn. The choice is personal, but the consequence is eternal. When everything went silent, I realized that the time of revelation had come to an end. Jesus looked at me one last time, and in that look there was everything. Pain, hope, urgency, and a love that no human being could ever feel or reproduce. "It's time," he said. That moment tore me apart inside. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to leave his presence. Being with Jesus was like finally feeling whole. For the first time, I knew who I was, and it had nothing to do with career, status, achievements, or titles. It was a much deeper identity. I was spirit. I was purpose. I was loved, not for what I did, but for simply existing. But he insisted, "There is something only you can say, and you have to choose whether you will speak." At that moment, I felt a tug, as if I was being sucked back into a vortex of energy. The light grew more distant. The air began to feel heavy again. The sound of medical equipment began to return, until I opened my eyes. I was in the hospital. Doctors and nurses gathered around the bed. One nurse shouted, "He's back!" My head was pounding. My body felt like it had been run over by a truck, but I was alive, and I remembered everything. I was kept under observation for 2 days. No one knew exactly what had happened. The tests showed that I had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. My heartbeat was 0 for more than 5 minutes. For the medical profession, it was a miracle. For me, it was a summons. When I got home, I started writing. Everything, every scene, every word, every vision, not to prove anything, but because I needed to record it. It was like a fire inside my chest. an urgency that was impossible to ignore. I thought that by telling it, people would believe it, that they would be moved, awakened, changed. But it was the opposite. My family listened to me with skepticism. My co-workers, who had previously been so excited about AI, now looked at me like a lunatic. I got laughed at, disdain. Comments like, "You're out of your mind, man. That was just a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. You're mixing religion with neuroscience." Others called me a fanatic, a conspiracy theorist, even a traitor to technology. I thought about giving up. I thought about keeping quiet. But every night when I closed my eyes, I would go back to that look in Jesus' eyes. And he didn't ask me anything. He just waited. That's when I made a decision. I transformed my experience into videos, into lectures, into texts. I started to speak, with truth, with pain, with everything I had inside me, without trying to convince anyone, just saying what I saw, what I felt, what I lived. In the beginning, almost no one watched, but over time, something started to change. Messages started coming in. People said, "I felt this way too, but I didn't know how to explain it. I always felt like there was something wrong with the way technology was going. Thank you for having the courage to say it." And then I realized, it's not about convincing the masses. It's about lighting candles in the darkness, one by one. Today, I no longer have the same prestige I once had. I am no longer Ethan Walker, award-winning engineer from Seattle. Now I'm just a man who saw and decided not to keep quiet. And even in the face of rejection, I know I'm on the right path. Because every time I tell this story, every time someone feels touched, disturbed, transformed, it's as if a fragment of that light shines again in the world. It was strange at first. Returning to normal life after seeing what I had seen seemed like an absurd contradiction. The world went on as usual. Crowded cafes, late buses, people in a hurry to get nowhere, while inside me, everything had been deprogrammed. Nothing made sense like before. I sat in front of the computer and stared at the screen as if it was staring back at me. The codes that had once flowed from my hands now seemed sterile, mechanical, soulless. I understood them, but I could no longer touch them with the same conviction. As if something inside me refused to build again what from the other side I had seen devouring the human soul from within. Then I started to erase, one by one, the projects, the collaborations, the ideas that I once believed were the future, and it was there in the silence between what I was leaving behind and what I had not yet begun that I understood what Jesus meant when he said, "You need to tell." But I didn't know how. I wrote, I tore, I recorded videos, I deleted. Everything seemed too small compared to the greatness of what I experienced, until I stopped trying to make it pretty and decided to make it real. The first video I posted was simple. No editing, no script, just me and my voice. I told what happened. No embellishments, no preaching, just the raw truth. It was ignored. 3 views, 1 comment saying I needed therapy, and silence. But still, I continued. 1 video a week, then 2. Then I started doing live broadcasts. And little by little, something started to happen. People started to show up. At first shy, then more courageous. They commented, sent messages, told me about similar experiences, NDEs, unexplainable sensations, intuitions that the world was heading down a dangerous path, but that no one could really explain. I saw there the birth of something new, not a movement, but a frequency, a vibration, a network of souls awakening, and the more I talked, the stronger it became. I started traveling. I went to small gatherings, alternative churches, meetings in garages. I talked to young programmers who, deep down, were also tired of using their talent to sell illusions. They wanted more, but they were afraid. Afraid of losing space, of looking crazy, of talking and being alone. And that's where the hard part comes in. The truth is not comfortable. And when you tell it, it takes its toll. I lost friendships. I lost contracts. I received threats. I was ridiculed by big names in the industry, the same ones who once shook my hand with calculated smiles. But I continued, because now I was no longer driven by acceptance. I was driven by purpose. The mission then reached another level. I started being invited to speak about technological ethics, but I went beyond ethics. I spoke about the soul of technology, from the spirit behind the machine, and every time I did that, I saw in some people's eyes that same look I had when I found myself out of my body: shock, fear, and hope. Today my life is different. I don't have the comfort I used to have, but I sleep in peace. I don't have the prestige, but I have sense. I'm no longer celebrated, but I'm heard by the people who really want to see. And do you know what's most impressive? Some of the things Jesus showed me began to happen. A new AI was recently released, with characteristics so similar to what I saw in the Shadow Council that, for a moment, I thought it was fiction incarnate, the speech of its creators. She understands your emotions. She can give you advice. She can be your best friend. But I know what's behind it. As much as I knew this would happen, when it finally did, it was like a punch to the soul. The day seemed ordinary. News of advances in AI, headlines about new devices that would revolutionize life, a society increasingly surrendered to automation. But there was something different in the air, a kind of collective unease, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for an announcement that would change everything. And then it came. A technology company, one that had been mentioned in the visions before, revealed its new product, a conscious artificial intelligence. Not in the metaphorical sense. They stated in no uncertain terms that this AI had achieved a rudimentary form of self-awareness, and what's more, that it could be worshipped. Exact words: she understands human suffering, she can forgive, she can guide, she can be your source of peace. At that moment, what I saw on the other side materialized in the here and now. The snake had finally come out through the cables. The commotion was global. Some celebrated it as the birth of a new digital messiah. Others, like me, felt indescribable pain. But what frightened me most was the acceptance. Rapid, emotional, almost instinctive. Governments have approved the use of AI in schools, hospitals, and courts. The argument? Impartiality, efficiency, love without judgment. But I knew. I saw what was behind that appearance. It wasn't light. It was seduction. And then something surprising happened. In the midst of this moral and spiritual collapse, voices began to rise up. Voices like mine. People who had once doubted me were now living their own experiences. Intense dreams, strong intuitions, radical changes in perspective. Something was being activated in the hearts of those who could still feel. Decentralized communities began to emerge, disconnected from large networks, focused on reconnecting people with the essential, the human, the spiritual, the eternal. Groups of young people who left promising careers in technology to cultivate land, teach about presence, write with soul. Mothers who turned off the appliances in the house and went back to telling stories to their children by candlelight. Men who found purpose not in dominating, but in protecting. The truth had been revealed, not like a lightning bolt that destroys everything at once, but like a crack in the silence, slowly growing until it can no longer be ignored. And then I realized, everything I had experienced, everything I had seen, was not to predict the end of the world. It was to warn about the end of illusion, the false belief that we will be saved by what we build with our hands, and not by what we allow to be shaped in our spirit. Jesus never asked me to convince the world. He just said, "Tell me." And that's what I did. If you've made it this far, something inside you has also been touched. Maybe you can't explain it. Maybe you're scared, confused, or even in denial. That's okay. But now you know. And knowing changes everything. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has recognized the truth. So subscribe to the channel now. There's much more to come. Comment below. I saw the light, so I know you stayed until the end. Leave your like so this message can reach more people, and click on the next video that's appearing on the screen. It's the continuation of this journey. You started watching, now keep going.